I'm very pleased to be joined by New York Daily News blogger and columnist Elizabeth Benjamin. Welcome to CityWide.
Thanks for having me.
I want to ask you a question that will be of great interest to the people who follow your blog. May not necessarily mean as much to our viewers that don't, but do you ever sleep?
Rarely. Yeah, I mean, I don't. You actually know a little bit more about me than some of the people do here, but I also train for triathlons, so in between that and doing this job, I'm not getting a lot of sleep, no.
It used to be that the news cycle was, once a day something would happen. Then we started to move towards a cycle where a public figure or candidate would say something in the morning, somebody would respond to it in the afternoon. But now the news cycle seems to be a 24-hour news cycle. Mm-hmm. How do you cover that?
It's difficult. I'm feeling like a little itchy, not like sitting here without my computer. Actually, like a little nervous about what I might be missing. But it is difficult. The cycle used to be, you're right, like a morning-night cycle, and now it's more of a, on the hour, if not on the half-hour cycle. And I think you just have to come to terms as a journalist with the fact that you're just going to miss some things. You're not going to get every, word that comes out of someone's mouth. It's just not possible.
Well, there also seems to be an awful lot going on. We have the Obama transition. We have shakeup in New York state government with the Democrats taking over the state Senate. Mayoral campaign on the horizon. It's a target-rich environment. What do you think are the most important things we should be looking for in 2009?
Well, certainly you touched on a lot of them. I mean, obviously it's going to be David Paterson's first full year. We'll start from the top and work down. Right? David Paterson's first full year as governor. He's having the opportunity. He didn't just sort of ascend accidentally to a position due to Eliot Spitzer's prostitution scandal. He's now a governor in his own right, starting from his State of the State address, which was not actually all that well received, and he's going to be shaped largely by the economic crisis and his ability to get the legislature to respond to that. And of course, the state Senate is now run by Democrats for the first time in over 40 years. And because of the leadership stalemate that occurred there between the Republicans and the Democrats, they didn't have a transition period. And so now they're going through a pretty large set of growing pains regarding the takeover of control. And so it remains to be seen what full Democratic control of New York State. I mean, there are really no Republicans left in any position higher than county executive, I believe, unless, obviously legislative minority leaders. But in terms of positions in which they have a modicum of power, it would be down at the local level at this point. And then, of course, the U.S. Senate.
By the time this show goes on the air, right, unless the unforeseen happens, and we've certainly seen a lot of that lately, Hillary Clinton will be the Secretary of State, and David Paterson will have made his choice who will be the new United States Senator from New York. So who's that going to be?
I wish I knew. I mean, by this point, I wish I could sort of put myself forward to the time where we're airing this segment and know, and I just have no idea. However, there are a lot of it's a conundrum for David Paterson, obviously. I mean, there is a big push for him to name Caroline Kennedy, who may at this point be Senator Caroline Kennedy for all we know. It's clear that the Obama administration prefers her. She was one of the few people in New York who actually endorsed Obama, whereas most people went with Hillary Clinton, who's, of course, the local favorite daughter. And it's clear, obviously, that the Mayor Bloomberg, also prefers her, and it's just to a certain degree of detriment, actually, in her case. Her rollout was not smooth, and the public polls just today, there's a Quinnipiac poll that shows that actually New Yorkers prefer Andrew Cuomo. I don't know that if he didn't do Caroline Kennedy, that he did do Andrew Cuomo, trying to project into the future, because there's a whole Cuomo-Kennedy sort of family dynasty fight there. There's a marriage that went bad, et cetera.
So let me ask you a question that I haven't seen discussed anywhere, and it may be that it signals something significant changing about New York tribal politics, and that is Kennedy in this sort of initial phase was asked about experience and some other things, not too much on policies, but we're in the middle of a period where there is strife in the Middle East once again. And I haven't heard any reporter ask her about Israel, about Gaza, about the Palestinian situation. And I'm wondering, is that simply because reporters are more likely to ask her what's on her iPod, or is it because Jewish politics isn't predominant in the current environment?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the first problem was that the unrest, the Israel rocket attacks on Hamas in Gaza had not started at the time that she was actually speaking to reporters, and she's not made herself eminently available. She did sort of a media blitz for a weekend and then disappeared off the face of the earth.
But when Nydia Velasquez's name was floated early on, one of the blogs reported that there was some concern that she hadn't been sufficiently strong on Israel,
right,
to be a New York State United States Senator.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's because, I mean, I would say it's a falling down on our part as reporters, because it's certainly not the case that the Jewish vote is any less significant, or you wouldn't have seen Mayor Bloomberg go to the areas where, in fact, rocket attacks had been sustained in Israel, and stand up very strongly, almost to the point where people criticized him, asking why it was that he was really so far out there, and held a press conference with the Israeli consulate general with a sort of exploded rocket as a prop before he went for 12 hours to Israel to show solidarity with the people. So I don't really think that it's a question of a reduction in the importance of the Jewish vote in New York. It's more, I mean, she's not been all that available. I don't know why she wasn't asked that question regarding policy. She was asked questions about education, but also the focus has been more on who's pushing her.
Right.
And so she was asked questions about Mayor Bloomberg, for example, and whether she would support Mayor Bloomberg or perhaps one of his Democratic opponents in 2009. And at first, she hedged, and then she was sort of forced into, through a spokesman, to say she would indeed support the Democrat, whoever that person may be.
Well, again, I don't mean to be politically incorrect, but I couldn't help but notice that, Shiki, Michael Daly at the Daily News, Steve McGuinness at the Carpenters Union.
There's an Irish thing here.
There's an Irish thing
saying?
going on.
Yeah.
It's the Irish are back in New York politics.
Well, certainly, also for the Daily News has been very intent on covering her, perhaps, even more so on a daily basis, maybe rivaling the New York Times a little bit, but in part, it's because of our readership. I mean, we have a certain kind of reader who I think the feeling is might have more of an affinity for the Kennedy name or an interest in the Kennedy name. So
is the coverage of politics today soap opera or drama? I mean, it seems not to be so much in depth. A very broad coverage, lots of things get into the blogs that would never get into a daily newspaper, but your typical post is going to be a couple of hundred words. It's not going to be in any great detail. And the challenge for a candidate or for a public official is to try and capture the public imagination rather than necessarily put forward the strongest position, or Shelley Silver is almost the antithesis of a political figure in the blogging environment. Is that good for democracy, the kind of coverage we're seeing now?
Well, I mean, there's so many things right now that are not good for democracy, right? So I'm not really quite certain where to start. I think that people being engaged and interested to the degree that they were, at least in the presidential election, and there was just such an enormous desire for information and a high participation in turnout across the country, that was positive for democracy, certainly. And there's also so many other places for you to get that kind of information. If you really want to know Obama's position on healthcare or Shelley Silver's position on healthcare or anybody's position, you can go to their website and read reams of information, white papers upon white papers. I don't need to present to you a distillation. I mean, of course, I'm defending myself here, but I am a pure political reporter as opposed to like a healthcare policy
And are you
reporter.
a reporter or a blogger and columnist?
I'm both. I mean, I'm all those things. I wear many hats. But, it's just my responsibility. Why you would want to get a distillation of somebody's position on healthcare, even if it was quite in depth, as opposed to going on to their website and reading it for yourself. You don't have to see it through my eyes. You can see it through, you can get so much now on the internet that you don't need me to present it to you.
I think the broad engagement of people, what it does, as opposed to just elites or the clubs or some other group controlling the decision-making process, what it does is it forces people in public office or who want to be in public office to be better communicators than they would have been even a few years ago.
Yeah, but there are some people still who hold elected office who aren't so fantastic at communicating, and yet they get reelected. I mean, it just sort of goes towards that all politics is local, old saw rather. But it's true. I mean, people in their districts are very strong, and when I see them perhaps on the floor of the Common Council or the City Council, for example,
so how could this be?
Yeah, they're not, particularly well spoken or particularly passionate about anything, and yet, they work the district and provide constituent service and are very popular.
Is there a difference, not so much in the city because the Republican caucus is so small, but in terms of the state legislature, is there a fundamental difference between Democrats and Republicans, not so much in terms of their ideology, but how they conduct themselves?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of how they, obviously, you saw the Senate, certainly there was a big difference when the Republicans were in the majority. They treated the minority not so fantastically, and that is sort of coming back to haunt them, right? That might be a function of whoever's in power. I don't think that's a function of political affiliation. But in terms of ideology, I mean, it really does differ around the spectrum because you have, for example, for example, conservative Democrats, right, of which Malcolm Smith actually is one. The new majority leader is rather conservative and ran, in fact, on the conservative and Republican lines before he stopped doing that, and now is championing things like abortion rights. But, I mean, the reality is that he sort of edges towards the pro-life side more. So there is definitely...
There aren't many liberal Republicans
There
left.
are some. Oh, yeah. No, like rocky Republicans? Sure, there are some. I mean, I would say that they're more in places where you would expect to find them, on Long Island, for example, where they tend to be more socially democratic and fiscally, conservative, right? Just socially liberal, fiscally conservative is sort of the phrase. But maybe and upstate you're going to find Democrats like Darrell Albertine in the 48th Senate District who is, opposed to gay marriage. And that is a position that supposedly is not one that is held by, commonly held in the Democratic Party.
Well, we'll talk about the epitome, the Democrat who turned Republican, who's now an independent, Mike Bloomberg, when CityWide continues right after this.
Takeout meals for just $12.99. Call now.
Sherry Pearson. You are the sole surviving heir of the King of Montanopolis, and you are now worth $45 million.
I'm rich! This can't be real.
Of course it's not real. Come on. Having money isn't about luck. Like that takeout meal. Cook at home instead, you can save thousands a year. Feed me.
Feed the pig.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're talking politics with Liz Benjamin from the New York Daily News. Handicap the mayor's race for me.
Well, that's tough right now, right? I mean, part of the problem is that we're not sure which Democrat of there's actually three. There's one who doesn't get a whole heck of a lot of coverage, and that would be Tony Avella. He's definitely in. I will say with some certainty that Tony Avella is going to see it through to the end, right? In terms of Anthony Weiner, the congressman, and Comptroller Bill Thompson, I'm just not sure. I mean, Bill Thompson spent a lot of time convincing everybody, or trying to convince everybody, that he indeed is going to run against Mayor Bloomberg, and billions be damned sort of thing. And then the same from Anthony Weiner. And Bill Thompson lately has been more vocal in his criticism. Weiner was very vocal in his criticism during the term limits battle, and then since has sort of dropped back a bit, although he had this 5-borough fundraising blitz not too long ago.
Right, but when he was asked about his intentions, he kind of blinked.
Yeah, and there's been reports of sort of anonymous sources close to him saying that he is a little, not indifferent, but, thinking about it and not certain.
Well, it's different to be a Democratic congressman when you've got a Democratic president than it is to have spent 8 years, fending off the Bush administration.
Well, it's not his Democratic president, remember. I mean, Anthony Weiner, out of many people in the congressional delegation, is probably among the people who was closest to Hillary Clinton and most vocal in her defense right up till the end, and even was a little critical of Caroline Kennedy, if I remember. So, he's certainly, it's true that you could probably get more done as a Democrat in a Democrat-dominated White House and Congress, but he's not on the inside, I don't believe, with the Obama team.
So let's take it as a given at the moment that Weiner and Thompson are both in the race.
Well, but you have to think, that's a difficult race, particularly for Anthony. I mean, he's going to run a primary against Bill Thompson, who's trying to be only the second African-American mayor of the city. I mean, that's difficult. Plus, coming off already losing once, coming very close, and sort of taking one for the team and deciding not to do a runoff, whether or not he could have, but deciding not to press the issue against Freddie Ferrer. You're going to do it again. I mean, it has even been suggested, and I'm not sure that I subscribe to this, but that if he loses again, a two-time loser, he'd be certainly weaker and ripe for a challenge in his own congressional race, which would be the next year after this year, so it would be 2010. Does he really want to do that? Plus, you're talking about a very difficult year to raise money. 2010 is going to be a tough year to raise money. It's going to be a tough year to raise money right now. We're waiting right now, and by the time this airs, we'll have known. The 15th was the deadline for the most recent filing. People are burning through a lot of money trying to raise money, and there just is not a lot of money around to have.
Yeah, but they do get matching funds, particularly.
Sure, but they're going to run against a guy who doesn't care, right? I mean, he doesn't need for matching funds, and he doesn't need for fundraising, and he's hired Howard Wolfson to be his spokesman. So, that's a difficult place to be in.
Let's talk about the argument. My words, not theirs, but it seems to me that the Bloomberg argument is been there, done that, and there's more to do. Mm-hmm. The Weiner argument is he's a real New Yorker. He gets us, we get him. He's the kind of feisty spirit that we need, particularly in tough times. The Thompson argument is, I think, a little bit more subtle, and it's both a plug for Thompson and a dig at Bloomberg, which is he cares about whether you have a job, not whether he has a job. Mm-hmm. Are voters going to respond to any of that? Is the Bloomberg persona so large, not to mention the checkbook, that there's no room for a debate? Or did the term limits fight, the tanking of the economy, create a vulnerability for Bloomberg?
Yeah, it's interesting. The term limits fight, certainly, what we saw in the term limits fight that came home was that the money that the mayor has spread around the city has really bought him a lot of goodwill, or at the very least has bought him a lot of support. You have people in all sorts of organizations, arts organizations, education organizations, nonprofits, who came out in droves to sit at a public hearing to say that we needed to keep this guy around for another 4 years. Why? Because he gave a lot of money away. I mean, the most cynical among us would say he bought those people off. The less cynical among us would say he's just, has a really big heart. But so that's one thing that we saw. And particularly at a time when there's an economic crisis, how many of those people are going to want to come out against him? Not many. The flip side of that is that at an economic crisis, you're already seeing the city have to take some measures to cut back on services dramatically, to cut back on the workforce. The pension costs are enormously high, which is a weak point for him. The Yankee Stadium whole debacle, a weak point for him. So there are weak points there. And I also believe that New Yorkers, jobs bleeding out of this city, services being cut, and all sorts of problems that are happening. Do you really think that they're going to buy the fiscal good management argument that the mayor's going to make?
Well, that's the question is, does Bloomberg have to articulate a vision for what he would do with the next 4 years, or is it enough for him to simply say, trust me, look, I know what I'm doing?
But does he, right? The argument that whoever runs against him has to make is he says he knows what he's doing, and you've already started to see that. You're seeing, in fact, Thompson just this week very hard coming out on the Yankee Stadium situation, which the IDA is scheduled to vote on Friday, which will, of course, already have happened by the time you all see this, and we'll know. But, is saying that was actually fiscal mismanagement because now the cost has ballooned up into the stratosphere, and is it even worth it? And that's a whole different show about whether or not stadiums that are publicly financed are actually good for a municipality. But so to suggest that, can they break through the noise that will be created by 75 million, whatever, 100 million was suggested, floated around at one point that the mayor might be willing to spend to get himself what exactly? 4 years of a total headache? I'm not sure. There are weak points to exploit in his whole sort of management history. But the problem is you can't exploit him if you don't have the cash, and if you're sort of trying to shoot, an ant with a bazooka with a guy who has $100 million to spend.
But that's where you all come into play, because my sense was that Bloomberg won the editorial boards. In fact, it doesn't bode well for a mayoral candidate when, you know, the 3 major dailies all came out in favor of your opponent getting another shot
Right.
at a term of office.
Right.
But I also had the sense that in the process of doing that, he lost the columnists and the reporters.
I agree.
He lost Room 9 at City Hall. That the sort of benefit of the doubt that he used to get as sort of a nonpartisan manager, it's not there anymore.
And he's been testy. You know, he's been very testy lately. It's not that he's been never testy. I mean, I think he has a habit of being testy, but he's been a little, you know, on edge. For example, to be asked a question about what Weiner said about your management in the morning at a Citizens Union breakfast, and to refuse to respond, not only to refuse, but to say, and if you read me the quote, all that proves is that you can read. Next question. I mean, what's that about? You know, why not just answer the question? It doesn't seem to me to bode well, right?
Or to say, it's too early for me to be involved with politics, but then to have Howard Wolfson on the payroll.
Yeah, and to be calling and to
respond.
have your aides call GOP chairman and say, hey, I'd really like to run on your line, or whatever, or go to the Brooklyn GOP holiday party. You know, I mean, if you're doing that, that's politicking. That's not just because you wanted to drink some eggnog with the Brooklyn Republicans. I don't think that's what that's about.
So much of the political space is occupied by the people at the top: Bloomberg, Patterson, Weiner Thompson, so the big names. This is a year where any number of elected officials at lower positions or people who are less well known outside of their own communities are going to try and break through. They're going to move from the city council to a borough president position, possibly, or public advocate, or whatever. Who are some of the stars in the making? Who are some of the people that, when we look back at this show 4 years from now, or 8 years from now, you're going to say, you know, these were the people that you should have been keeping your eye on?
Well, I mean, right now it's all sort of trying to sort itself out still, but you have a lot of people who were up-and-comers, like Michael Lasher, for example, who's a young sort of wonderkind who used to be a consultant and now works for Jerry Nadler. He was going to make a run for Gail Brewer's seat, except Gail Brewer is going to stick around because of term limits. So you have a lot of people who are sort of ran into the brick wall that was term limits extension and have decided to take a pass for 4 years. Then you have the public advocates races, of course, probably going to be the most active because that's the one place where the incumbent is not going to seek re-election, and that's going to be Betsy Gotbaum, of course, is leaving. Now she's sort of interviewing everybody who wants the job, and I don't know if she's going to sort of come out one day and proclaim that, yes, she supports de Blasio, for example, or yes, she supports Eric Joya, or that'll be a very active and interesting race, and all the people who are seeking that seat are pretty interesting. I mean, Norman Siegel has said he won't do it again. This is the 3rd time he's running. Right. Certainly, you know, has the resume for the job, one could argue. John Liu has been fearless in his criticism of the MTA, of the speaker, where a lot of people are, you know, loath to do that sort of thing, to step out of line. So he's a person that's interesting to watch, and he raises money like gangbusters. De Blasio, always interesting to watch. You know, people speculated he might depart for a Clinton position in the administration. Obviously, that didn't pan out. Right. The term limits lawsuit that he brought didn't pan out, so that was a loss for him. Joya, another huge fundraiser, young guy, up-and-comer. So that's a very interesting race. The comptroller's race, also interesting, although, you know, the departure of Carry On sort of takes the air out of that race a little bit, the expected departure of Carry On, although by the time we may know, right? So this is all very difficult to game this out. The council races are going to be fascinating. What will be fascinating about the council races is who sticks around in terms of challengers to challenge incumbents to say, you know what, and how much the term limits issue becomes a problem. I don't know that voters are that concerned about term limits. They didn't rise up the way that I think some people thought they would because of the economy. Had the economy not tanked the way it did, maybe we would have seen a more sustained opposition. But so far, people are worried about, you know, feeding themselves and roofs over their heads and getting a job. I don't think they're concerned about term limits.
Well, we'll have to get you back on the show in a couple of months and see how some of these things work out.
I don't know about that.
My thanks to New York Daily News blogger, columnist Liz Benjamin. I'm Ken Fisher. Thank you for joining us on this edition of CityWide.